Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here once again and to participate in this Nyingma summer seminar on our second weekend in the Mahayana section, and to serve at the pleasure of the Mangala Shri Bhuti lineage. I have given some thought to this weekend, and perhaps I had a tentative idea of what I would speak about, and then I heard Kongtrul Rinpoche speak last night, and it somewhat rearranged all my ideas, as is very typical. I think one of the intimidating aspects about Buddhism, maybe in general, and Mahayana Buddhism in particular, is the scholastic emphasis. I have grown up in a Buddhist community, and this emphasis on study that goes along with practice, there's a lot of emphasis on it. However, if I am encountering someone who thinks of themselves as Buddhist or is Buddhist in another context, generally it is due to the connection with something more personal. For instance, the view to be kind to all beings, to have compassion for all beings. And there isn't really any scholastic emphasis. There isn't even a basic framework for something like the Four Noble Truths. It's just a very heavy emphasis on being kind and compassionate, and that is excellent. And maybe in the past I have had some judgments about the lack of personal understanding about the Dharma as a path, not just the Dharma as a concept or the Dharma as a very vague way of being or something that you saturate yourself with by having enough statues, by wearing certain kinds of clothes, by speaking in a certain way, by being vegetarian or something like that, or wearing charms or malas or amulets. And so maybe I have been a bit critical about that in the past. However, the emphasis on scholastic Dharma also has another element where I think Rinpoche pointed this out last night, when we are so involved with the philosophy of Dharma, and particularly in the Mahayana, the philosophy surrounding emptiness and the arguments and the debates and counter-debates and refutations around emptiness and relative and absolute nature and different approaches, that it tends to take something away from, as he says, thinking in terms of Dharma, thinking in the sphere of Dharma. And I have really emphasized that more technical knowledge in the past, and in past Mahayana section NSS talks. So this time, rather than going through all the steps that maybe lead up to the understanding of emptiness, I will do some of that. I thought maybe to emphasize the tenacity, the willingness to be with one's mind in the name of compassion, in the name of a kind heart. And my big focus in recent years is on Lojong. And I have put a lot of thought into how to describe Lojong or explain Lojong to different people. And one of the things Rinpoche said last night was, the first instinct isn't to apply Lojong. It is to cover the insecurity with pride. And I do believe that is generally the case, even if there is a technical knowledge of the Lojong mind training, the verses on mind training, and the philosophy behind emptiness, and the rationale behind why one is engaged in the four immeasurables, such as equanimity, compassion, kindness, and sympathetic joy. We don't always feel ourselves in the position to make compromises for Dharma practice. We feel like we're making compromises in order to practice. We are compromising something else in order to be a practitioner, or in order to extend ourselves towards others. And what are we actually compromising? We are compromising that attachment to self. We are compromising our own self-interest. And again, as Rinpoche said, it's a wonderful thing to really focus on compassion and loving kindness for others, but there does come this point where the compassion I feel for others and the compassion I feel for myself, they reach a point where they start feeling mutually exclusive, where they're a conflict of interest. I can't think about my own self-interest and think about others' interests or be compassionate for others, because they start conflicting with each other. And in the Way of the Bodhisattva, I believe, Shantideva says, if I give this away, what will I have left for myself? And he says, this is the thinking of the lower realms. And then if I keep this, if I hold on to this, what will I have to give for others? And he says, this is the thinking of great beings. And this is where we tend to stutter in our Dharma practice, regardless of education or time spent in a Dharma-saturated environment. There has to be a point where we actually walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And Lojong really is that space, in my opinion. And Lojong does fall under the context of really understanding what it means to let go of this attachment to the sense of self, to really understand how there is no real self to be attached to. If we look for that sense of self to be attached to, all we really find are maybe symptoms of attachment, the five poisons, the five kleshas: attachment, aggression, stupidity, jealousy, and pride. We see this manifestation of feeling and really intense visceral experience, which makes the story of a self so convincing. And was it Joseph Campbell, or who wrote the Power of Myth? Joseph Campbell. So within his books, there's this ongoing theme that human beings are storytelling creatures. We tell ourselves stories much more so than animals do, but the most basic story we tell ourselves is that there is a self there that we cherish and protect. And all other stories, whether they are correct or incorrect, or whether they we feel that we must promote these stories to the world, we must express our truth. We must allow that to kind of expand outwards and affect others. However our preferences for the world manifest, however our preferences for what life should be like manifest, it all starts with this very basic story that there is a sense of self. And we really only infer that self because of all the attachment that is caught up with the idea of self. But when we actually look for that self, and we look for that self within the framework of the five skandhas, is the self the body, is the self the feeling, or is it the form, is it the feelings, the concepts, the thoughts, or the consciousness, such mental formation and consciousness, where do we actually find that self? A big part of seeing the egolessness of self, the emptiness of self, is when we look for the self in those five skandhas. We look for the self within this framework which covers the entirety of our experience. There is nothing that exists outside of form, feeling, mental, or conception, mental formation, and consciousness. That really covers everything. And we could do the same for maybe a more detailed breakdown of experience and phenomena, like the 12 ayatonas or the 18 dhatus, but stick with the five skandhas. We don't find a genuine sense of self. We are free from any kind of solid, permanent, or autonomous self. That is generally the definition of real, something that really, truly exists in an unrefutable sense. It must be solid. It must just not be made of parts. It can't be compounded. It can't be broken apart into different pieces. It must be permanent. It must be stable and not fluctuating, not changing rapidly. The self must be the self. It must be some kind of eternal self. And it must be autonomous. It can't depend on anything else. So, solid, permanent, and autonomous. But we never find a self that is solid, permanent, or autonomous. And in that same vein, we don't find any thing. We don't find any phenomena. We don't find any object or person or even concept which is truly intrinsically real. That is solid, permanent, and autonomous, existing from its own side. When we once thought that the atom was the building block of all things, we assumed that it could not be broken down any further. The atom is the basic building block of all things. And then we find out that the atom is made out of electrons and protons and a nucleus and so on. And so then where is the reality? Is it in one of those? Is it in all of them combined? Is it within that specific configuration of electrons and protons and so on? And it turns out no. Electrons don't seem to really differ so much one electron to another, but the things that really make the most difference in our life can be defined by just having one extra electron. That's how the periodic table of elements really works. Just adding one little electron or one little, additional piece of an atom changes the entire element. Now it's, an earth alkali metal. Now it's gold. Now over here it's, plutonium. There's a big difference between gold and plutonium. There's a big difference between plutonium and salt. But it's really just additional electrons. And electrons don't really differ that much, one electron to the other. It's just how many we have in an atom. So that starts determining the molecule or the element. So Now we look for reality in these pieces, but we don't find a solid reality, even within electrons. So no phenomena is solid. No solid self, no solid outer phenomena. Permanence. We don't find a permanent self. The self is always changing. The self is always changing even in opinion of itself. I'm a good self, I'm a bad self, I'm a young self, I'm an old self. Nothing remains permanent. It's all conceptual. And those concepts even change moment to moment to moment, just in terms of time. And we don't find anything that's genuinely permanent in the outer world either, even if it appears very stable, even if it appears to be unchanging. We now know that there's even some sort of carbon decay of this matter. So even though it appears like it's not changing, it's changing moment to moment to moment. So we don't find anything that's permanent. All things are impermanent. All bodies are impermanent. All planets are impermanent. The sun is impermanent. These things that we give so much permanence and solidity to, they are within a certain view, very fleeting. Within the history of the universe, our own solar system is quite fleeting. Within even the history of our galaxy, it's the sun, it's only a few billion years old. That's nothing in terms of some other stars and planets. You really start seeing the relative quality of life when you look into outer space, or you look down on the microscopic level or the atomic level. The larger your view becomes, or even the smaller your view becomes, of how nuanced the world is, or how vast the world is. It's just incredible how our own assumptions, our own stories about self and phenomena break down very quickly. They just launched the James Webb telescope is now sending back images, and they're saying that it's looking at galaxies, it's looking at it's astronomical, literally astronomical, the scope of what we're seeing. And I believe it was Scott he mentioned this. He said that this view that has like 12 galaxies in it, this one photo, if you were to actually say how much of the sky the telescope is looking at, you could hold up a single grain of sand and just hold it up to the sky, and that kind of square, that pixel of space in the sky, that's what it's looking at. So it's just incredible what we're not looking at as well. And so in the face of this vastness, what is our own story about self and phenomena? How well does that hold up? It's not even autonomous. What exists that does not depend on something else? How do we exist if not for our parents? How does anything on this planet exist if not for the sun, if not for cosmic explosions in outer space? What is it? The calcium in our teeth supposedly comes from an exploding star from another galaxy. Okay. It's maybe makes us think differently about our teeth. We can appreciate our teeth when we brush them or something like that. But if you think about it elementally, our whole body is just a temporary stopping point for so many elements that are in the midst of not exploding, but still moving to other locations. The mass in my body will eventually become something else. It'll become a tree, it'll become a car, it'll become someone else's food, it will become a new star in time. It'll all be recycled. Matter is never created or destroyed, it simply changes shape or it changes form. So this is one of the kind of laws of physics. And if we think about this in terms of self, if we think about this in terms of how important it is to extend care beyond self, to feel the warmth of our heart for other beings, it really challenges that ego attachment. The ego can know all this. We can know all this and still feel resistance to mind training, feel resistance to the four immeasurables. If you have resistance to the four immeasurables, if you are still holding on to some kind of asset or backup or preferential fortress around self, then it's going to be very hard to think in terms of Dharma, to really put your mind in the sphere of Dharma. I mean, if anything, there comes this existential crisis when you look into the void, and the void looks back and says you are small and you are insignificant and you do not matter. And that, I mean, that is somewhat true, but what does it mean to matter? Already we're projecting some kind of idea of mattering to who? Mattering to what? Matter, meaning, this is something that we experience for ourselves, and it is not a lie just because we realize how the world naturally is on this relative level. When we realize emptiness, when we realize that there is no solid, permanent, or autonomous person or phenomena in the world, does that destroy the world? It does not. And this is, was it Nagarjuna who said this? When you realize the truth of phenomena, it's not as if reality shatters around you. It's really that you've actually seen what is true. You have penetrated your own assumptions about the world. So, I said I wouldn't get too technical about this, but I have to give a little context because when we broach this idea about suffering, when we broach the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, and we start looking at suffering and the cause of suffering, that attachment to the sense of self, when we seek to be free from suffering by removing the cause of suffering, and we set out on the path to cessation, the cessation of suffering, and we start encountering the four immeasurable practices. Immeasurable not just in the sense that they have the potential to benefit limitless beings, but we have to push that limit. We have to push our own ability to extend care because it can go on immeasurably, that we have an immeasurable capacity or immeasurable potential to wish for other beings' benefit, that we can extend more and more and more within that wish to benefit beings. When we come up against, or not up against, but when we encounter emptiness in the Mahayana view, there is a tendency to fall into this nihilistic state. No more meaning. If it's not about me, then what's this all about? If there is no me, then what am I doing here? What's the point of all this? Our default behavior is to think about ourself. And so even in the face of such cosmic connection, the ego tends to revert back to itself and to think about itself. Being faced with being so small, it still reverts back to just thinking about myself. There's no point in thinking about anything else because it's not relevant anymore, or it's so temporary, or it's so meaningless. This is a very insidious view. It's a very insidious habit which tends to pop up among the educated, because it is the educated who will really come in contact with this logic. It is the educated people who send probes out into space, who look at the world under a microscope, who see that there is nothing really that we can hold on to, and yet the habit, the tendency to hold on to the sense of self is so strong that even in the face of something that disproves a solid sense of self, that's where we default. I think Rinpoche mentioned in the Hinayana weekend that His Holiness was observing a number of quantum physicists who were speaking about the nature of reality and relative reality and what is absolute. There's this whole documentary, what is it? The Rabbit Hole, or no, what is it? Man, we were all watching it in like the early 2000s. Oh yeah, What the Bleep Do We Know? Yeah, and then there was like a follow-up to it as well. And when you see people who are so engaged with how there is nothing to hold on to, there is no reality to hold on to, and at the same time being so in conflict with each other about their views or their findings or their publications, or who gets to speak first, or who gets to present the data, or who gets credit for these things. And shouldn't just the discovery of our place in the universe really make us humble? And even in our current culture, humility is not a positive thing. It's seen as a negative thing. To be humble, to be to have humility, to be humiliated, it has this more negative connotation. And I wish there was some better word that didn't have that association, but to be humble really has a quality of nobility to it. The greatest kings are the ones who are humble. The greatest rulers are the ones who are humble. The greatest teachers are the ones who are also humble, who don't act like they know everything and don't feel even the pressure to act like they know everything, to put out that appearance, to make up that story, or to present that story, that identity to the world, to be very honest and genuine with not being intrinsically real, not needing to be solid, permanent, or autonomous, accepting that we are made of parts, we are compounded, we are impermanent, we may not be remembered, if being remembered is really what we want to spend our whole life trying to accomplish. We may not be remembered in 1,000 years, but that doesn't make this life any less meaningful to who we are right now and where we are right now and to the people we are with right now. And being autonomous, independent, the cowboy mentality, as Rinpoche calls it, this kind of tough stoicism. I don't even know if it's truly stoicism. The stoicism has more to do with being able to be present with life even during its difficult times. It's not about separating oneself entirely from the world or feeling like you're invalidated if you rely on others. We do rely on others. I was just watching something recently about cooking. It's one of my interests and my hobbies. And it's suggested that we become human beings, or we became human beings when we learned how to cook. Our whole physiology cannot survive on eating a 100% raw food diet. Our digestive system isn't long enough, our teeth aren't big enough, our jaws aren't strong enough. So our whole physiological makeup depends on cooking through some form of heat or fire or boiling or something like that. So just dependence on fire, not even dependence on other people, but just dependence on fire. If we have no way to heat things, if we have no way to transform the food around us, we will die. No one currently alive can really get away with eating pine cones or raw grass, like a goat can. So we cannot fool ourselves that we are totally autonomous either. So this is a bit of preamble. I want to come back to Lojong because this is where I feel that a lot of the Mahayana really is, at least as far as practical application, in my experience. There is this emphasis on mind training. Lojong means mind training. And while it is difficult to turn the mind towards Lojong, turn the mind towards mind training in the face of difficulties, in the face of the ego flaring up, if we have the smallest amount of emotional intelligence, not just intellectual intelligence, if we have that emotional intelligence that knows to value compassion, that knows to value kindness, and is willing to lean into that, eventually that will develop. And eventually the warm heart, that sewa, the warmth of feeling towards others, the care, the sympathy, however vague, however remote, if that natural intelligence that we don't maybe even have an intellectual reasoning for, if that develops, then Lojong will become accessible to us. There are a lot of reasons why it is good to be compassionate, how it is good for us, how it is good for other beings, how it transforms our own mind, and also can be a benefit to the world. But this is stuff that we understand intellectually. That warmth of heart, that experience of meaning, that experience of joy, that experience of going beyond self, you don't need a technical knowledge. You don't need a reason to enjoy that. You don't need a reason to feel that that is valuable. That is something that is felt between family members. That is something that is felt between friends. That is something that we experience naturally without the need for an education. And so I want to come at Lojong from this angle. Why mind training, which sounds so technical, which sounds so intellectual? Why approach mind training from this point of having a warm heart? The more warmth you have, the more the Lojong makes sense on a very personal level. Because we do have habits, we do have these tendencies that get in the way of our warm heart, or somehow twist our good intentions. As Rinpoche said last night, it's like an ongoing battle. It's a losing argument where the where the ego comes up with so many reasons why not to be kind. It's like, oh, but I don't really have the energy to spare for this right now. I really need to think about myself and my self-care and stuff like that. Or I've been working so hard, I need some time off. I deserve to take some time off. And that is true. That might be true. You don't want to just push it until you break. You want to work up to it. You want to build on that. But the ego can really use that as an excuse to hold back. The ego can really prevent us from making that kind of step. If you're training to be a weightlifter, you don't stay at the same weight. You might plateau here and there, but you have to push beyond the limit in order to grow. You can't just say, oh, I'm sore today, so I won't go work out again until my muscles get weaker, and then I'll work out again and get right back to the same level I was. That's how you just kind of bounce around in the same area. If we want to feel the warmth of our heart extending outwards to others, if we really want to live authentically according to how the world naturally is, greater than us, but still minutely connected to us, totally interconnected on the smallest level, so that even the structure of our teeth comes from a distant galaxy. If we are connected on that level, and yet the self is so small in this context, aren't we living more authentically when we live beyond the concern for self? We live in service. We live in the warmth of compassion. We live with the warmth of kindness. Isn't that an authentic way to live, given the natural circumstances? I really think so. And Lojong doesn't just create a nice definition of the world that we try to fit into, where all things are empty of an intrinsic existence. Lojong is very much geared at combating the ego's arguments, the ego's naysaying, the ego's narrative. And remember, it is a narrative because where is the ego? We don't even find it when we're looking. We're still talking about this sense of self as if it's real. But it's not. If we actually look for it, if we actually go through the whole process of, is it in the form skandha, is it in the feeling skandha, etc. Is it in my body? Is it in my consciousness? Is it in this emotion? Is it in that emotion? Is it solid? Is it permanent? Is it existing from its own side? None of these things. But the habit is still there. So the Lojong does have such verses that really point to the nature of phenomena, such as consider all phenomena to be like a dream. I believe this is verse 2 or 3 in the Lojong text by Chikawa Yeshe Dorje. like a dream. Not that it's meaningless or that we're falling into a nihilistic tendency, but it's very much there. It's visceral, but at the same time empty of an intrinsic existence. It's not destroying the world. It's understanding how the world naturally is. And once you understand how the world naturally is, whether it's on an intellectual level or more importantly on that indescribable level, that level of value, that level that feels the warmth of the heart, that emotional intelligence, when you understand emptiness on an emotionally intelligent level, a personal level, then those arguments of the ego don't hold up. Life is like a dream. You live in a dream, you experience a dream, but you can't really hold on to a dream, as you can't hold on to a mirage, as you can't hold on to a rainbow. It can be enjoyed, it can be, we can talk about it, but it's really not something that you can grasp to. And it's the grasping that causes so much distress and pain and suffering. The grasping to the sense of self, the grasping to outer phenomena as real, intrinsically real. So the Lojong is a series of counter-arguments to the ego and its narrative. And some of them are very poignant, some of them they really hit home. I've focused on don't be a loyalist to ego, don't be so predictable. Those are two different translations of verse 30. I've been focusing on that for about 12, 13 years. And it still has so much relevance, not just in a teaching capacity or in a philosophical capacity, but if you take that one verse as a mantra, don't be so predictable, don't be a loyalist to ego, and you just have that kind of running in the background of your mind. And then all the times where, someone got angry at you, and the natural habitual response was to get angry at them because they were angry at you. Just the other day, someone was driving recklessly behind me at night, and they were like flashing their lights, and then they passed me on the highway, and my first instinct is to like start flashing my lights at them. Like, how do you like it? Predictable. I am being a loyalist to my ego. Why do I need to do that? Because the ego wants gratification. Don't be so predictable. Don't be a loyalist to ego. Why am I doing this? Because I don't have a reason, except that the ego wants me to do it. Am I going to be loyal to the ego? So, I did flash them once before I actually caught myself. I was like, no, really, my hand was like pulled back on the button, and I was like, okay. So it's hard to catch yourself all the time, but if you have these things as like a mantra against the arguments of ego, against the narrative that the ego is presenting, where you have to act a certain way, you have to behave a certain way, you have to treat the world a certain way, or value yourself a certain way, or put yourself above other people, or just have more emphasis on self-interest rather than compassion in general. You want that to be a losing argument. And Lojong, the text on Lojong and mind training in general, provide those counter arguments so that the ego loses the argument. And even more than understanding that on an intellectual level, you want to understand it on a very personal level. And I don't always understand why how do I say this? I don't trust my ego. And that's kind of a lesson I've learned. And through Lojong practice, I can kind of tell when it's the ego telling me to do something. I don't always know why I am applying a counter argument. I don't always know why I'm acting contrary to the ego's wishes. It might seem that I'm acting outside my own self-interest just for the hell of it. But it's because I've learned to really distrust the ego and distrust its narrative, that even if I don't understand why, I know the value, I really personally know the value of stopping in my tracks and thinking about what I'm doing. Even if it costs me something, even if it costs me time, even if it costs me opportunity, I want to take a break and just make sure that I'm not coming at it because of my ego. I'm not taking this course of action because of my ego. If I feel the ego is involved, well, I want to take a break and make sure I know what I'm doing. And that is from that verse, don't be a loyalist to ego. If I feel that I'm doing something because I'm a loyalist, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. It doesn't matter even if it will benefit me. I want to make sure that I know what I'm doing. So I don't even have a reason. I don't even have a legitimate reason to work against the ego just because it is the ego. That's why I do this. That's why I take a beat. And maybe in a larger context of the Mahayana, as one of the things that distinguishes the Mahayana from the Hinayana vehicle is that there's a lot more focus on intention. There's a lot more emphasis on our motivation for why we do things. It's not just the act of compassion, it's the intention of compassion. It's not just the conduct, it's the motivation. There's a lot more emphasis on conduct in the Hinayana vehicle. And in the Mahayana vehicle, there's a lot more emphasis on motivation. And if we're focusing on our motivation, even if it's apparently a compassionate act, even if it's apparently generous, if there's this weird little argument that the ego is putting forth, like, oh, do this, it'll be good for you. If you give them a gift, then they'll owe you later, that kind of thing. I gotta watch that. I gotta watch, because then it really undermines the actual act of being generous. And if we're still thinking that it's all about the outer activity, it's all about the outer, action, and it's not about the intention, then we're really not fully connected with the Four Noble Truths, where ego is the cause of suffering, attachment to self is the cause of suffering, and that altruism and letting go of the attachment to the sense of self is the cause of the cessation of suffering. Generosity is an altruistic act, but if we're just placing all of our faith in the outer action, if we're placing all of our eggs in the appearance of generosity and not what generosity genuinely does to us, how it uplifts our mind when it is genuine, when it is honest, when it is not tied up with some sort of ulterior motive, then we're really not going to get the benefit of generosity. It's just going to be the appearance of generosity. And there is a certain hollow quality to being very generous just to get a tax break. There is there's something suspicious about it. Not that it's bad. It benefits so many people. But there is a reason why generosity, by and large, tends to come from people who have less in the world than people who have more. If you compare the charities given by the wealthiest people in the world to the people who don't give or don't have much, people who don't have much give far more as a percentage of their income than people who are wealthy. And even though, it might donate like $1 million here, it still shows that there's something being held back. If you're giving $1 million, like, oh, I'm being so generous, out of my 100 billion, whereas someone who gives $100 out of the $1,000 that they have, they're giving 10%, whereas this other person is giving maybe 1% or less than 1%. Where is the generosity? It's not just in the number, it's not just in the action, it's in the willingness to give up some self-interest, to give up something which the self really craves and holds on to. And so the benefit will be greater for the person who not gives more, but is more honest about it, who has less ulterior motive. And who gets the bigger tax break? The $1 million donor. So, it's not always about the outer action. And it's not to say that, neither of these acts of generosity benefit other people. They do. But there would be more benefit if the ego wasn't involved. So, getting into mind training, getting into this more visceral sense of why intention matters, of why mind training matters. I think there's a lot that we can access there. And I'm taking kind of a new approach on this. This is a bit different for me, to really come at it from the direct experience side rather from the intellectual side, because I've spent so long telling myself why compassion is a good thing. Really reasoning through it, studying Lojong kind of according to that view. Like, look, it makes sense to practice Lojong. It makes sense because all things are naturally empty of an intrinsic existence. It makes sense because the more that you focus on intention, the more you are genuine with intention, the greater the effect will be. So it's all kind of well reasoned out. But to someone who has great emotional intelligence, they don't need this reasoning. It feels very natural. And I really appreciate that. I don't necessarily have that. That's not my primary strength. I need more reason. I need more reason to be compassionate. I need more reason to be kind. And that's what makes this sense of nihilism a bit of a pitfall for those who really depend on reason. You get into relative and absolute truth, and then this idea of relativism really comes out strong. And being able to see that the world is relative, that there is nothing that you can truly grasp onto. Even then, the ego tries to turn that to its advantage. Like, if everything's relative, then why can't it be relative according to me? According to my preferences. Like, rather than holding on to an absolute and having the absolute be something that we can depend on or call upon or call over to our side to prove a point. Everything's relative, so I can just think about myself. I can just act according to myself. I've heard that some of these verses on mind training can sound a bit privileged, because we're working with suffering. We're working with the suffering on an internal level. We're not expecting to change outer circumstances. We're hoping to transform suffering on an internal level, to change our own motivation, to change our own grasping to the sense of self. And then we will be free from suffering. And when someone hears, just work on, your own mind and, work on your own motivation and then you'll be free from suffering, isn't that kind of a privileged position, because you're not really dealing with, worldly issues. You're not really dealing with how tough the world is. I can see where someone might be coming from. I can see how someone might think that leaning into a spiritual path in order to live a meaningful life and to be free from suffering is a more privileged position. But it's also a position that really assumes that the suffering is out there, that the suffering is real, that the suffering is true, and it's inflicted upon us, and that we're just escaping into our own minds or escaping into this idea that everything can be solved from within. And my response, maybe not to that person, but certainly my response to myself when I expect the world to conform to the way I think it should be, is, now aren't you acting a little privileged? Assuming that suffering is out there and it's being inflicted on you, oh poor you. Poor Jampal, who has suffering inflicted on him by all these outer conditions. Oh, poor Jampal, who can't get the world to agree with him. That's definitely my more privileged mind when I am thinking in the sphere of ego instead of the sphere of Dharma. When I am a loyalist to ego, as it says in the 30th verse of Lojong. Aren't I really privileged when I can lean into a nihilistic and yet somehow egocentric worldview? When I believe the story which the ego tells me, when I believe that fantasy, that I am somehow more special than other people, or that as the main character of my own story, I am the victim of suffering in the world and not part of this vast interconnected sphere of cause and effect. Where am I actually taking responsibility for my own mind? In the sphere of ego or in the sphere of Dharma? Who actually holds the responsibility? The sphere of ego pushes the blame onto others. It avoids taking any personal responsibility for the mind. The problems out there, the problems in society, the problem is systemic. I mean, it might be true on a practical level. But as far as my own mind goes, as far as my own suffering goes, where can I actually take responsibility? in this systemically broken system with so much negativity, where can I actually take responsibility? Because if I don't take responsibility, then I'm just part of a system. Part of a system, and how can I change that? I have to demand change. Demand change from who? Demand change from other people. And can I reasonably expect that those demands will be met? If I have great karma, if I have great force of will, if I have the right cause and conditions, maybe. But then I'm still seeking to fix the world. I'm still seeking to change the world according to ego, according to a very particular narrative, according to the ego's motivation. The right action with a slightly twisted motivation. So it makes more sense to work for the benefit of beings while simultaneously letting go of attachment to the sense of self, to take responsibility for our own mind, and not to expect that everything will be fixed permanently in the outer world. And if we are really looking through the scope of emptiness, what was there ever to be fixed? There is nothing to be fixed. Not to say that, everything is meaningless floating molecules from cosmic explosions, just coming together for a moment and then dissipating. Not really to say that, but to say this world is so vast and so interconnected. It is not something that lends itself to being fixed. It is beyond our own narratives, our own concepts, our own views of right and wrong, good and bad, this or that. It is beyond extremes. The extremes of existence and non-existence, of both and neither. This is really where the prajnaparamita and the understanding of emptiness really blows a lot of the ego assumptions out of the water. And I'm going to leave a lot of that for this afternoon, because I'm sure that Elizabeth has a lot to say on Prajnaparamita and the Heart Sutra, and that kind of dynamic of views. But I'll also add that if we are genuinely pursuing this Dharma path, if we're thinking within the sphere of Dharma, if we have that strong intention to follow the warmth of heart, to follow the tsewa, and to develop the four measurable practices, genuine equanimity, not being partial in our care or kindness, genuine compassion, to think of others just as we think of ourselves, and then eventually even to think of others more than we think of ourselves, but to build up to that, to build up to the practice of tonglen, the exchange of self and other, where we exchange our happiness for others' suffering, to really feel that resolve to put others first, to, as it says in the dedication chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva, to be an isle for those who yearn for landfall, a lamp for those who long for light, for those who need a resting place, a bed, for all who need a servant, may I be their slave. I mean, some of the language, it just sounds inconceivable how we could do this. How could I be an island for those who yearn for landfall? And yet, there are so many small insects that tend to take a rest on my shoulder or sometimes on my head. And my immediate thought is, get off. But I am an isle for those who yearn for landfall. It takes a lot of work to fly. I am a resting place for those who need a bed. However small and irritating they are. I am literally food for some insects, mosquitoes, for instance. And while I'm not always the best island because I have a tolerance limit of how many I allow on me at a time, I can still work to be a good support for other beings, to go beyond myself, to have that exchange. And within the context of Prajnaparamita and this view, I'm gradually letting go of the thing that blinds me to the true nature of reality, that blinds me to being my most authentic Buddha nature, free from delusion of self, free from attachment and rejection, free from emotional obscurations, free from cognitive obscurations. I'm working on that, starting from the ground up, starting with the warmth of heart, combating the ego's narratives, combating the story that it tells me, combating its arguments, its very sly, double standard, insidious arguments with Lojong and mind training. And seeing something, penetrating that story, deconstructing the story, even of existence and non-existence, to find something genuine, to find something beyond explanation. And then to let go of the intellectual pursuit and just to rest in that space, to let it be very genuine, not to make up some new story, not to make up some new narrative, not to somehow again twist it to fit into the ego's sphere of thinking, but to be genuinely present. That's what could be more meaningful than that. So, if there are any questions?
Dungse Lap, thank you very much, for your Dharma and with the emphasis on narrative and stories. Excuse me. You emphasize that quite a bit at Illustrious Moon. And wow, didn't see this coming. It's really opened up another dimension of contemplating the Dharma and reflecting and introspection with the teachings. So thank you. I appreciate very much. Now I'm going to attempt to formulate my question through a narrative. You spoke about, you gave the example of, thank you. You gave the example of Scott was very excited about the telescope, and that what the telescope was seeing was enormous, multiple galaxies, and how, when you really think about what that represents, it's just a grain of sand in the sky. That does something to our perspective, and it creates an openness of understanding and knowing in some sense. And when we were building this temple, we had a Mennonite contractor who almost decided that they couldn't work on this temple because of what they felt it represented to them as something that was in conflict with their own religious and spiritual beliefs. But through conversation and connection, we got past that. And I feel he was a very spiritual person, and so he was able to get past his ideas and intellectual ideas of religion and spirituality. And at one point, when we were looking at some of the more of the work to be done here, we were on the 3rd floor, and we were walking back in, and he stopped and he turned around and he said, "You know, this view really puts it all in perspective." So again, there's that greater sense of knowing. And you also talked about the scientists, His Holiness Dalai Lama, and scientists being able to scientifically and intellectually explain reality, but not necessarily having the emotional intelligence, I would say, maybe. And I really appreciate your distinction and clarification between intellectual and emotional intelligence. So within that narrative, I'm thinking my question lies sort of, if you could elaborate or speak more about the difference between these two, and particularly in a context of, we often put a big emphasis, and you were touching on this for yourself personally, which is, I think, what's inspired my question. We put a big emphasis on kind of this scholarly understanding, and almost to a point where that's more important. But I really feel like it's that emotional intelligence that is actually more important, and I think you were expressing that today. They're both important, but in terms of a practitioner on this path, and I think any genuine spiritual path, I don't know, I guess I want to leave it there and yeah, I'm not sure if I can totally articulate, but I think maybe you might have a sense of what I'm getting at.
So more on the emotional intelligence and critical intelligence.
Yeah, within the context of sort of this narrative and how, there's sometimes this importance on you have to have a scholastic or intellectual understanding that, it's almost like seeing that is more important in the Dharma sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe one thing on storytelling and narratives in general, it's not purely intellectual. There's very emotional and visceral quality to storytelling, and great stories do kind of make us feel things. It kind of pulls on a heartstring for us, and in some storytelling, that's particularly the case when you're writing a villain, And I've heard that if you can write, a great villain, then, you've really done some good storytelling. And, I think of Harry Potter, there's the villain that, is pure evil. But then there's this other, I don't know about villain, but just someone that no one likes. And she's like a school teacher and becomes the dean or something like that. And just everyone absolutely hates her. And it, more than the main villain who's, murdering thousands of people. And, this just school teacher for being so nasty and not even murdering anyone, I don't think, in the whole story, but still being just so vile in personality. It's like, wow, this is what got everyone angry. So, there's the kind of Pixar movies that really try to make you cry within the first 10 minutes of the movie. Like, oh no, their mom died. Like, oh no, his wife died. There's always like there's something tragic that happens in a Pixar movie that really tugs on the heartstring. The imaginary friend dies in one movie, and I still cried that it was an imaginary friend in a movie of a girl who didn't exist, and she wasn't even aware of it. It was just like within her memory that she just forgot about her old imaginary friend, and I cried at that. So storytelling really does have this element of pulling on the heartstrings, and maybe even pulling on some of the attachments that we have around self or associations we have, so it can draw on our emotions and sometimes on our negative emotions. I don't know if I really hated so many people in life as I hated this imaginary person in a book, which is so bizarre, to have a negative emotion drawn out of me by a story. So storytelling is not just an intellectual thing. It's also a very visceral and emotional thing. And the ego tells great stories. It doesn't always have to make sense. And as far as the emphasis on scholastic versus emotional intelligence, odd thing is, I don't think that story is an intellectual story. I think it is, once again, a story that tugs on the emotion of pride. That I've put so much work into this, I am so intelligent, or, this institution is so intelligent, it's so elevated, higher learning, it has this sense of being better or being more right or having more evidence of being right, but it's actually just another ego story. Something that the ego has pulled on this heartstring of pride, and that double standard, that ulterior motive has really seeped itself inside the story that we culturally talk about in regards to academia. And in some ways it does have to do with the challenges of our country, and as I mentioned last weekend, we try to respect all religions, but then that sometimes leads to this idea that all religions are the same, or all religions are kind of beneath the level of academia that sees everything objectively, but can't see itself objectively in that same sense, or can't have the humility, or can't see its own pride, or has no humility to really see itself as just another form of views, just like all religions. And I hope she doesn't mind, but Kata, if you're watching, I want to tell a story that you told me. And I thought that this was very indicative of exactly what you're saying. So Kata, one of our students, was getting a position at, Harvard Divinity School. And as she was there, she was kind of being introduced to, the staff and stuff. And then there was, I'm not sure what their position was, maybe like the dean or the person who kind of oversaw a lot of the departments, and Kata's coming in kind of more as a Buddhist person, and she walks into their office, and the person's kind of uh, dismissive. It's like, okay, fine. Like, so what do you believe? You're a Buddhist, huh? So what do you believe? Like, what's your thing? And Kata wasn't sure. Like, Buddhism? Like, what do we believe? You know, and for one, I think it shows the attitude of academia in some, not in all cases, but it's a tendency. It's a tendency. It's a trap that we tend to fall into. So, no, okay, fine. You got all. This is Harvard Divinity School, so you know it's a lot of different religious traditions, and the person's like, okay, fine. What do you believe? It's a bit dismissive. And Kata's thinking about this, and she says, compassion, because that's what His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said. Our main tenet is compassion. And the person who she's talking to kind of thinks for a moment and says, excellent, I love it. You know, welcome to, you know, the team. And it's like, okay, you know, we do get caught up in a lot of, you know, views, and maybe this person was just burned out by all the different views arguing with each other, you know, and needing to be a part of all those conversations or arguments or, you know, funding or who knows what. But you talk about compassion, talk about something that is accessible to emotional intelligence, and you get it. You just understand, and you know the value of it. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to reason with it. It's just right there. So I remember that story, Kata, when you told me that story, and I really have kind of held that for a while. And again, it's a story. It's a story about Kata. It's a story about someone having an experience. So the story can draw out wisdom. The story can draw out neurosis. Stories can draw out all kinds of things. But then at the end of the day, it's like a dream. You can find the truth within this world. You can find enlightenment within this world. You don't have to somehow exist outside in some, you know, separate intellectual or distant or personal plane in order to find enlightenment. Enlightenment is not something you drag from outside. It's something that you find within. It's already here, Buddha nature. So a story can reveal that. And there's a long tradition of teaching stories in Tibet and in many countries. There's the in the Middle East, there's the sage Nasruddin. In Jewish tradition, there's the fool Herschel. You know, there's teaching stories of like Coyote and Anansi. I mean, there's so many teaching stories from wise characters, and in Japan between the gods and the yokai and so on. And you find wisdom in these stories. But if you hold on to a story too much, if you make self and ego too much a part of a story, then it just pulls more neurosis into your life. And that's essentially what living in this world is like. It's empty, just as a story is empty. It's always been empty of intrinsic existence. When you start making that a part of ego, when you start allowing ego to narrate life, that suffering is out there, that happiness is found out there, it's not something that's naturally accessible, then we suffer. But if we're able to let go of the story, see the story as a story, or see the wisdom in a story and then let it rest and dissolve, then so much freedom there. And that's really a big emphasis in Mahayana, the vehicle.
Really?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any from online?
Hi, Dungse. We do have some questions from online. The first question is from Murray Nossel. He asks, Dungse, thank you for this magnificent teaching. and for sharing so generously from your self-reflection and experience. You talked of spending many years questioning why be compassionate, and that now you're looking at it more from the perspective of lived experience. For me, it seems to be the other way around. Direct experience is so much my way of learning and thinking, but now I'm wondering whether I need to turn more towards a more intellectual approach. How does this sound to you? I'm kind of looking at it as a must do with maybe some self aggression thrown in there.
Well, that would be a danger of going the emotional route all the way. Um, at a certain point, you do have to be able to explain the path to yourself. At a certain point, you do have to be able to tease out where that where the ego has inserted itself into compassion, so that compassion does not have equanimity. As far as emotional intelligence goes, equanimity is a very hard thing for emotional intelligence to tease out all on its own. It's very hard because we have, so many feelings and warmth towards certain people, and then, the neurosis kind of excludes other people, and it's hard to tell the difference. It's hard to catch that without some of the analysis, without some of the self-reflection, without some of the, again, the Lojong reasoning, and really looking with a clear mind. You need to develop a certain critical intelligence at a certain point, but it's so much maybe easier to start with compassion, to just start with the warmth of heart. And I believe Rinpoche mentioned this in a previous NSS, or at least I think he mentioned it in his book on Sewa, is that it's better to start with compassion than it is to start with wisdom. It's hard to develop wisdom off the bat. It's easier to find a connection to Tsewa than it is to wisdom. Wisdom has to be there at a certain point, but it's easier to start with compassion than it is to, get so kind of sucked into the intellectual aspect and, why one should be compassionate and then reason it out in that sense. I think my disposition has generally been towards the reasoning side, and that's maybe just my tendency. So I don't know if I would call it a weakness that my emotional intelligence is a little bit less than my intellectual reasoning, or the emphasis on reasoning, or whether or not that's a strength. I couldn't tell you, but in either case, my disposition tends to lean in that direction. And also my circumstances, because I felt myself being challenged a lot by being a Buddhist in many environments where I had to explain why I was a Buddhist or why I had to believe what I believed. Boarding school is not the kindest place for someone just to believe what they believe without being challenged by their roommate, dorm mate, or teachers. And I felt like I had to explain things a lot. And then when I came up short in explaining why I believe what I believe, then I had to study it. And I had to make more of a point of why I follow the path that I'm on. And I'm sure there was some neurosis caught up in there, like just needing to prove myself, needing to prove my point, or feeling uncomfortable or inadequate that I didn't have a good explanation. And I can't just communicate my feelings to other people in my dorm and somehow make them understand emotionally how much it means to me. I'd sound like a hippie. And it's a school of hippies. So I didn't think it would work. I was going to be outdone either way. So I think that's why I've had this emphasis on really being able to explain something to others and being able to explain it to myself. It's because I'm constantly challenged by that. And I don't know why, but maybe something about me, uh, when I walk into a room full of new people, I'm like, someone says, "Oh yeah, he's a Buddhist," and then someone's like, "Oh yeah, you're a Buddhist? Why?" It's like, I don't know what about me draws this out in someone else. It's like, you want me to explain? Okay. So, anyways, that's why I have gone in that direction. But I do feel that starting with Sewa is maybe easier, and certainly it can form a stronger basis. But you have to have wisdom at some point. You have to be able to tease out the difference between attachment and genuine compassion. You have to be able to tease out where we are holding back in our care towards others, that equanimity, that sense of equanimity. And again, this is my more intellectual emphasis. I really feel that equanimity is a linchpin in the Four Noble Truths, the Four Measurables, because there's so much compassion in the world, and I feel it, I see it, and I see people just driven to tears by compassion, driven to tears by kindness and wanting to help the people. I see so much goodness in the world that way. And then it's like a rocket with no stabilizers. It just all over the place. It can't go in one direction. It just cannot stabilize itself because it's trying to go everywhere. It's trying to do everything and ends up working against itself. There's no direction. There's no guidance. It's just an explosion of compassion, which then burns out and never reaches its destination. That's why I have such strong feelings about equanimity and how important equanimity is. And then I meet someone who's so full of compassion. I try to explain it to them, and they're like, "Look at you and your intellectualism, trying to shut down my compassion, trying to shut down, these strong feelings I have to benefit the world." And like, yeah, it kind of sounds like that. It really sounds like I'm trying to suppress your kindness or compassion. And I hate feeling like I'm in that position. And that's, again, where someone might call me privileged, because I don't have the same flaming desire to benefit others the way they do. And yeah, probably not. I don't have that great well of inspiration and feeling. I am more driven by my just solid decision that this is what I'm going to do. And it takes some time to really work up a fervor to get myself going. But either way, whether your disposition is more for thinking it through or feeling it with your emotional intelligence, the two have to come together at a certain point. And you can't stay aloof and locked in an intellectual tower, and you can't just be scattered all over the place with an explosion of compassion either. The two have to meet at a certain point. And it is in the Uttara Tantra Shastra where it says, "It is on the wings of wisdom and compassion that you cross the ocean of samsara." That's within Asanga's text, or Buddha Maitreya's text laid down by Asanga, the Uttara Tantra Shastra. That's really what it says. Nothing to be added, nothing to be removed, everything exactly as it is. So when you kind of see the nature of phenomena, the nature of self, and then to progress forward, you need the wisdom and compassion. That's how you cross the ocean of samsara, on those two wings. If you have one wing, you flop around and it's hard to get anywhere. So Murray, to address your point. If you feel like you've been leaning very heavily on one wing, try to exercise the other. Get it warmed up, get it going, but you're going to need both at a certain point. Martha.
Thank you, Dungse, for these teachings today. I think we all here are so appreciative of just everything that you're offering from your study and practice and experience. I really was touched when you were talking about, because this is my own weakness, was where you said specifically, I've really learned to distrust the ego and to stop in my tracks and think about what I'm doing. And then on the other side of that, even if it costs you something, time, opportunity. And so and also then you brought in the other kind of tendril within generosity, which I think is so tricky, at least for me specifically. So I'm kind of wondering, in a rubber meets the road kind of way, so many times, at least from my own personal experience, I think I'm doing something good, or I think I'm offering something, and there's a little something there, wanting something on the other side, or, being human. But then also I find like the generosity, like we're on this tight team, making NSS work. So you don't really have time to think about yourself. We're going to make this work. We're going to make it great. Like that's kind of the motivation. There's enough for everybody. But then sometimes I really do fall into myself when I think I'm doing something, and it's so subtle, but it's really self-serving. Do it all the time. And but I guess I'm just wondering, you seem to have really cultivated this even when the aggression comes up, with the flicking of the headlights, and in so many ways, like, how can we all be more skillful with this? Because this is really the rubber meets the road, at least for me, and also living in community. And I really am hoping, at least coming from this talk, that I can allow myself to pause more and to let go of that expectation of getting something. I mean, it's so nice just to not do sometimes. And I want to say one more thing. And when I get what I want, it's really not what I wanted. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of nice for a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of like chocolate cake.
Yes. Yeah, it's, I've noticed, I have the sensation of really craving food a lot of the time. The idea of it, and, the taste of it. And then sometimes I found that if I go buy a food or a restaurant, I just go by the place, and then I just stand outside and go, that's better than the actual taste. The smell is actually better. There's this kind of like craving. The food is never as good as it smells. The food is never as good as I imagine it to be. But somehow smelling it is like the halfway point for me. So that's a funny thing. As far as where the rubber meets the road and taking a pause, I really rely on this one Shantideva quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it's in the 8th chapter, the patience chapter. And he mentions when, negative kleshas arrive, remain like a log of wood. And I remember translating this when we were in India, and I thought, what does that mean? Remain like a log of wood. And again, this is maybe, my disposition, but I actually do that. So for those people who, deal with me more intimately, or who know me, and, I get in conflict with sometimes, they might notice that I just like pacing around a room, and then I just stop. And then I keep going. But that's the pause. I literally imagine a tree, and I imagine being a tree, and then once I'm the tree, I look at like, what's the mind doing here? Like I cease action, cease conversation, just like take a breath. Okay. So sometimes the pause can be really long, and I've actually had people say like, what are you doing? Like, we were just talking. And it was like, yes, hold on. I'm just thinking about what I'm going to say. And, there's so many verses, like a single moment of anger can ruin kalpas of positive merit. It can destroy future lifetimes. There is no army, there is no, what Rinpoche say, there's no dictator in the world who can harm you as much as your own mind. Like, they can kill you and they can take all your stuff, but that's about as much as they can do to you. They can't ruin your future lives. They can't take your future possessions. They can't rob you of merit. You rob yourself of merit with the reactions of negative mind. So I liked that verse. And so when I feel like I get in these heated conversations and who knows what I'm going to say, I stop and remain like a log of wood and then really think about what's going on. And of course, when you're in the midst of stuff, you can't always stop. I mean, I did once on the street and I got some looks, but you can't always physically stop, but it's just kind of the sensation of what's going on here? Like, don't take myself so seriously. Like let's set the story aside for a minute and kind of critique it. Let's edit this story. Let's see if it really holds up. The internal editor. You can use that to your advantage here. Not just self-criticism, but self-reflection. That's really where that is. And I'm not sure for someone who has a bit more of a karmic disposition where they move faster than I do. They think and speak faster than I do. I'm a very slow-moving person in general, so I lean towards that. Just stop. But for me, that is a strong rubber meets the road moment, where I just,
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And there's so much of letting go and stopping, because there's such a propensity, or like there's so much of a movement towards whatever that goal is in that moment that the ego is like really wants, but to have that clarity to just stop, and then it's almost like you just kind of watch the train go, but you're not on it anymore.
Yeah. It's not unlike those old psychological experiments where you snap a rubber band on your wrist. Like, it's negative reinforcement, I guess. Like, you do something bad, it's like, bad! A little bit of pain sends negative reinforcement around a bad habit. But in this case, it's not, snapping a rubber band, it's just stopping entirely. So it's a kind of same concept, but a different approach.
It's much appreciated. I'm going to try that out here a little more. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Elizabeth. And then we'll jump online again. We don't generally have so many in-building questions for these.
It was a juicy talk, I felt. And thank you so much, Dungse La, and also everyone who just kind of opened up some of the pieces that you spoke about. So since we started having the conversation after the talk, I've heard the word intellect and emotion as two separate things. And it's interesting because I never think of this approach, the Dharma approach, as either emotional or intellectual. Like when I think of the Buddha on his pilgrimage toward enlightenment, I don't think of him as an intellectual, but rather somebody who's asking deep, deep questions with so much longing about the human condition. And I think that's very different than what I usually think of as intellect. So I was just curious if you can speak a little bit about that, because emotion doesn't quite seem right. And I think of, Rinpoche's book, Emotional Intelligence, is the way to describe bodhicitta, because I know compassion is not a synonym for bodhicitta, but often people think it is. So there's that aspect. And then on the other hand, I think more of prajna not really as being intellect. And this is more what I'm interested in asking you to discern the difference, because maybe what you're talking about being intellectual is just this incredible gift of discerning intelligence that, I mean, this is what we have. You know, the three prajnas is how we embody the Dharma. So I was just curious why this word intellect, and what do you think is the difference between intellect and discernment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for the purposes of approaching the subject, it's helpful to think of things either in an intellectual sphere or an emotional sphere. And Rinpoche does talk about emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence, like he talks about these. Once we get closer to absolute bodhicitta, once we have established absolute bodhicitta, not just the four measurables, I mean, I say not just, but really, I mean, they are very potent, but once those become bodhicitta, once they are aspiration bodhicitta, the wish to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, once that becomes engagement bodhicitta, the action and activity and motivation that does serve the benefit of beings, and then with the understanding of emptiness, absolute bodhicitta, where we find absolute bodhicitta, I think that's where the two start merging, and they're not so distinct anymore. We talk about compassion and wisdom Uttara Tantra Shastra and the two wings, but I see those two wings kind of as absolute bodhicitta as a whole. You can't really have that great insight of absolute bodhicitta without having both compassion and wisdom. You can't have absolute bodhicitta without the two meeting and really becoming this greater sense of awareness and not even something that you can totally describe, but something that has many names, something which you can directly experience, but has so many facets and qualities like enlightened nature itself. It's not just seen from one angle. The qualities of enlightened nature are not just seen from one angle. For instance, if you say the Buddha is compassionate, does that mean compassion is Buddhahood? It's not quite like that. It's like the Buddha radiates these qualities, but those qualities are not necessarily the defining characteristic for enlightenment per se. They are all awakened aspects of one nature, the enlightened nature. So when we mention prajna, at least in my own mind, that kind of wisdom element, that's not prajna on a purely intellectual level. It's prajna as it fits holistically within the realm of Buddhist thought, in that it is not devoid of compassion either. It's maybe just slightly emphasizing one more than the other, but not separate entities by any means. And I mean, emotional intelligence is still intelligence. There still has to be a certain level of understanding to it, a certain level of self-reflection to it. And as I say, with intellectually understanding the Four Noble Truths and the Four Immeasurables and developing wisdom, there has to be some direct experience and confidence that's gained from that. It can't be totally theoretical. So even in the very beginning, they still have some elements of each other, but they start becoming one as you reach absolute bodhicitta. At least in my direct experience, I don't feel that absolute bodhicitta, despite the emphasis on wisdom that we mention when we're talking about Dharma, I don't feel like absolute bodhicitta is a purely intellectual element, because there must be that basis of the four immeasurables. There must be the equanimity, the loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy. I mean, if I were to think of equanimity as the more intellectual side, and then compassion, kindness, and sympathetic joy as being the more emotional intelligence, all of those are bodhicitta. So bodhicitta as a whole, and particularly absolute bodhicitta, I think you can't really distinguish or separate the emotional intelligence from the wisdom and critical intelligence in that sense. They're both integral to bodhicitta as a whole. And that kind of developing more into the qualities of Buddhahood and prajna and so on. It's more my understanding, and I could be wrong about that. But at least as I've experienced it, the distinction doesn't seem to matter. The distinction between, intellectual and, emotional, it seems to be more of a social thing. When we talk about like the intellectuals of the world, and then, the emotionally intelligent people of the world, it's more like personality types. But does that mean that we are limited in our ability to cultivate absolute bodhicitta because of our personality? I don't think so.
Or what is the quality of mind to bring toward the Dharma? Because I think of intellectual maybe as, maybe there's some rightness in there. I don't know. We all define things differently, but it's interesting because I'm just thinking of prajna as being like this very open, curious mind, driven maybe by even devotion. Some of these teachings, the studying Madhyamaka could be seen to be a devotional activity. So what is the quality of mind that engages, like the three prajnas? Is it intellectual just because you're very discerning, that you're very careful in being clear about what you're thinking? Does that mean it's intellectual exactly? Or is it, I'm just trying to identify, well, what are the right words? What are the maybe useful words to use? Those words didn't work for me in the conversation. That's why I brought it up. And this is just my understanding of the words, but it seems to create a little bit of dualism that I just thought maybe might not be helpful.
Right. No, it does. It does make the conversation somewhat dualistic as we kind of start taking sides on the emotionally intelligent or the intellectual, sides of the cultural zeitgeist, or however it is. The quality that continues forward. Hard to say. I think the thing that tends to separate these qualities the most is ego attachment. Because if they do become less and less distinct, the closer we get to bodhicitta and the more we cultivate bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta in particular, I think it's really the ego that tends to make so many distinctions. And again, ego narrative. It's like if in this conversation anyone felt like, oh, well, I'm more of this, or I'm more of this, or, that applies to me, but this, I don't know about this. Ego. Ego is making an identity. Ego is starting to weave a story around this aspect. And there's nothing so appealing as like validating in a positive way. Like you could be a sun, a moon, a star. Which one are you? It's like, yeah, it sounds positive. It sounds awesome. It's like, I was once a star, look at my teeth. But it's the ego saying, like, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use this to make it about me. So, that would be the distinguishing factor in my mind. Any conversation that really gets into types or distinctions or personalities, I think it generally boils down to ego, because everything else is temporary cause and conditions. Who knows? I could be very emotionally intelligent in later in life, or even in my next life or previous lives, and then this is just a temporary thing that my disposition is leaning in this direction. So it's just temporary. No need to make a big deal out of it, except for the ego. So, yeah, I don't know if I could add any words or descriptions or good qualifiers to that aside from that. That's the distinguishing factor in my mind.
Thank you.
We have another from online.
This next question comes from Linda. She writes, during my childhood, there was abuse on many levels. Through therapy, etc., I learned that my ego was teaching me to be defensive, arrogant, special. Even though these are negative qualities, they also protected me in a way. So I have been spending time understanding and having compassion for my ego now instead of combating it. My ego is kind of a friend that I can look at differently. Do you find this to be possible or dangerous?
Possible, but to a point. Just by the conditions that we live in, based on the world conditions as they are, it's very hard to get by in life without leaning into your ego to some degree. I mean, that is what the ego does. The ego looks out for itself. And if it's not looking out for itself, if it's not looking out for what it thinks are its own interests, then we very well could be swept away by whatever our karmic conditions are, or just by the energetic movement of the world. I don't want to say chaos per se, but just things happen so quickly in life and with such intensity sometimes. I mean, just looking at our current world situation, there's just so much going on, and it really feels like if you aren't taking care of yourself, you could get swept away, you could be undermined, you could be taken advantage of. There are so many ways that we could be harmed if we weren't taking care of ourselves. And that is the ego's job, per se. And for a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they would probably lean into that the ego is trying to help. The ego is putting up its defenses to protect you. And that is probably true. What we are looking at is a sphere that is larger than this one life. We're looking at this life, our past lives, and our future lives. And if it was just about this life, if there were no consequences after this life, then probably a great deal of our emphasis would just fall towards looking after yourself. There would be no reason to worry about the future or future lives or escaping samsara if there was just oblivion after death, if it was truly nihilistic in that sense. However, what action has not yielded a reaction? And since so much of our life is in our mind, so much of our activity is mental, it seems a little optimistic that we won't have to deal with the consequences of our mind in future lives, or that there is no future. There is no mind that will face consequences after death. So that's a big argument in the realm of reincarnation. So the ego does provide us with a lot of assets for living in the world according to these world conditions, according to a world which has really been established to emphasize ego and individuality and looking after yourself and pitting one person against another. A lot of the conditions are like that. As human beings, we're maybe luckier because we have more ability to adapt. We have more ability to choose how we're going to live. A tiger can't choose to be a vegetarian. Its conditions require it to look after itself, to just live by killing another being. As humans, we have more options. But even as humans, sometimes we don't live in an area where we can grow food or harvest food or live off the land in that vegetarian sense. So our conditions do force us to live certain kinds of lives, sometimes more egocentric lives, where we're forced to look after ourselves in practical ways. So I don't want to step over those conditions or just say they don't play a role. However, if we do have choice, if our merit does allow us to have a choice, if we find opportunity where we're not constantly under threat like an animal is in the wild, or we're not constantly distracted like a god is in the heaven realm, or if we're not totally waging war like the asuras, or tortured or in combat, or under unthinkable pain like they are in the Sura hell and Preta realms, if we have that moment of peace, then we can actually plan for a future beyond this life, if we have those conditions. And someone might say, again, it's like a privileged position, and it is. It's a privileged position. I'm not talking about a privileged situation as in, social standing or something like that, but privileged due to our merit, due to the good causing conditions of this life. It's not as if Buddhists don't believe in privilege. When we talk about the first verse of Lojong is first train in the preliminaries, train in the Lojong, and particularly the reflect on the qualities of this life, reflect on the strengths and assets of this life, your capability. The freedoms and advantages. Yes, the freedoms and advantages of this life. That is a privilege, not a privilege that's undeserving. You deserve that privilege because it is due to your merit from the past that you end up with those privileges to begin with. But it is a privilege. And when you have that privilege, what do you do with it? You take responsibility for it. You don't just leave the privilege, otherwise it gets wasted. You have to take responsibility for the privileges by following, this Dharma path while it is accessible to us, while you do have the freedoms and advantages, while you can plan for a future life. If you don't have the conditions to plan for a future life, like a tiger or a crocodile or something like that, and you're just trapped in this situation where you have to kill in order to live, and you have to keep running in order to survive, then you can't even find the freedom to practice Dharma. The freedom to practice Dharma is an incredible privilege, and that's why there's such an emphasis on it in the words of my perfect teacher. It's such a rare occurrence, like a turtle coming up from the ocean, a blind turtle coming up from the ocean once every 1,000 years, and just so happens to get its neck caught in the yoke, in a wooden yoke that's floating on the sea. Inconceivable odds, but once it happens, you got to take advantage of that. So if you have not had that ability in the past, if circumstances did not allow us to follow a Dharma path in the past, those are the conditions. How can you blame the ego for being ego? How can you blame yourself for being trapped by conditions? You shouldn't blame yourself. You shouldn't feel guilty. That's how it was. But now, if you have the right cause and conditions, it's not a matter of pressure. It's not a matter of guilt. It's not a matter of, you should do something. It's a matter of whether you're going to take responsibility for this great fortune and start turning your mind towards the future. It doesn't erase the past, but you can start thinking of the future. It doesn't mean that the past is null or void, or that there will be no consequences, or that doesn't exist or something like that. It's just a matter of choice. And if we feel that our past doesn't allow us to have a choice, then we're really trapped. Then we're really stuck. If you have the freedoms and advantages, and I don't know, due to self-aggression or self-judgment, or it would probably be self-aggression or self-judgment, you feel like the path isn't appropriate anymore, then it's going to be very hard moving forward on this path. When the path is accessible, like this gift, this incredible gift is given, if we think, oh, I can't accept that because of the past. I mean, many great Dharma practitioners were murderers and did many terrible things in previous lives, or even earlier in that one life, in the case of Milarepa. And seizing the advantage, seizing that one opportunity, and moving forward, taking responsibility for having a blessing. That's something that it's hard to accept in contemporary life, I feel. There's so much guilt, or there's so much like, I was this, so I can't be this. Inability to transition, inability to hold both your past and the potential for your future. Where we're so stuck by our past, we're so stuck by trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, whether it's on our mind or subconscious or built into our DNA. What's that? The body keeps score. There's this whole thing about like racial trauma and hereditary trauma, passed down through generations. If we can't find a way to seize the opportunity which is given to us, the greatest triumphs among different peoples. Thinking of maybe Jewish people in particular, or Tibetan people. Huge cultural trauma, emotional, physical, racial, however you define trauma, and then having a new start, having a fresh start or an opportunity to make something out of a life that was destroyed, and then really thriving and succeeding. These are great examples of a people doing this. And if a people can do this, an individual can certainly do this. But it doesn't always come to be, because it's hard to let go of that past. It's hard to not even let go of the past in terms of like erase it, but let go of how it binds us, how it makes us unable to transition. It's not about erasing it. It's about being capable within the moment of acknowledging what has been and still being able to take responsibility without being bound by outer conditions. Outer conditions being the past at this point. That's tough. That's really tough. But it means no judgment on the past. If you have this opportunity now, take it now. If you have these very precious cause and conditions now, don't judge on the past. Move forward. It's presented to us. It's possible for us. And if it's possible, why not take it? Why not move from dark to light, as Rinpoche says, from the intense heaviness of the past to this kind of brighter future. And that will also ensure that we continue moving from one bright life to another bright life, if we continue along those veins. If we have these advantages now and we allow the past to hold us up, then there's no guarantee that our next set of circumstances are going to provide that opportunity. So, yeah, I hope that addresses your question. Oh, we're over time. Thank you very much for this morning, and It's my pleasure to be here, and I will be able to speak with you next weekend. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may I defeat the enemy of wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings, emulating the hero Manjushri, Samantabhadra, and all those in knowledge. I too make a perfect dedication of all actions that are positive, emulating the hero Manjushri, Samantabhadra, and all those in knowledge. I too make a perfect dedication of all actions that are positive, emulating the hero Manjushri, Samantabhadra, and all those in knowledge. I too make a perfect dedication of all actions that are positive. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, where it has arisen may never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more.